A long-form World War II audio story. The War Department called places like Red Mesa detention facilities. Local newspapers called them camps. The men who built them out of raw timber poured concrete floodlights, and wires sometimes use a harsher word after sundown when no officers were near enough to hear. Concentration camp. The distinction mattered to lawyers, politicians, and historians. It mattered less to the people who woke under the towers each morning and slept beneath them each night. War had a habit of changing the meaning of ordinary things. A train became a transfer. A crate became a shipment. A woman became an enemy national, then a prisoner, then a file. A soldier became a guard and learned that standing still for 12 hours beside a fence could be as morally dangerous as charging across a battlefield. In Europe, the war was devouring cities. In the Pacific, it was devouring islands. But in the American desert, far from artillery and collapsing capitals, another kind of wartime machinery worked quietly, methodically, and with the same love of paperwork that fed every empire in history. Camp Red, Mesa sat in Arizona, where the earth looked flayed by light. The mountains in the distance were purple at dawn and iron gray by noon. Wind came low and abrasive across the flats, dragging dust into every hinge, every plate, every eyelid. The barracks were lined in rows so exact that from the watchtower they resembled ledger marks. Between them ran hard-packed lanes named for numbers instead of people. Everything about the camp suggested efficiency. Nothing about it suggested mercy. By late 1944, the camp held several hundred German prisoners, a smaller number of Italian detainees, and a separate restricted compound that did not appear on postcards or in recruitment posters. The restricted compound was reserved for prisoners whose movement, identity, or knowledge made ordinary captivity seem insufficient. It contained no grandeur and no mystery, one seen at ground level. There were only extra fences, a quieter mess hall, stricter inventory, and guards told to remember that some captives could be dangerous with nothing but memory and language. The train from the coast arrived just after sunrise on an October morning. Its brakes screamed in a way that made men flinch, even when they expected the sound. Soldiers formed two lines. An officer read names from a board. The desert stood around them like a witness that had already seen too much and planned to survive one more century without comment. Staff Sergeant Samuel Reed stood with the escort detail, cap pulled low against a light. He was 32, from Dayton, Ohio, a former schoolteacher who had once believed the world could be repaired by maps, good shoes, and patient repetition. The Army had taught him otherwise, but not completely. He had a face that could look stern at a distance and tired up close. His younger brother had died outside St. Lo in the summer, which meant grief now traveled with him in silence, like a second canteen hanging from the shoulder. Men who had lost brothers were often expected to grow simpler. Some did. Reed had become more exacting instead. Special transfer, Corporal Ed Brogan said beside him, squinting at the rail car doors. Let's hope they're worth the paperwork. Everything in this camp is paperwork, Reed answered. Brogan spat into the dust. You know what I mean. The doors rolled open. A line of prisoners descended under guard. Most were men, gaunt and stiff from the ride, uniforms altered by travel and captivity until nationality survived mainly in cut and habit. Then came the women from the restricted list, 5 in total, each carrying the same government-issued blanket bundle and the same expression of controlled exhaustion that war had distributed widely from Warsaw to Naples. 2 were middle-aged, 1 limped, 1 was so thin that the rail car seemed to cast a shadow into her, and 1, third in line, came down with her back straight and her face set not in defiance but in refusal to break in public. Her name, as Reed would later read on the transfer manifest, was Anna Weiss, 27, German, former Luftwaffe Signals Auxiliary and language clerk attached to a transport and communications unit in northern Italy before capture during the Allied advance. English competent. Classification. Restricted handling pending review. She paused only once on the platform, not because she feared falling, but because the sun hit her hard after the darkness of the rail car. She blinked, turned slightly, and Reed saw that she carried herself like someone who had spent too long learning that visible weakness invited administrative consequences. Her blonde hair had been cut roughly at some earlier station. Dust marked the hem of her skirt. There was nothing glamorous about her and nothing pitiful either. She looked like Europe looked in that year. Hungry, disciplined, damaged, and proud enough to make suffering harder than it needed to be. The lieutenant reading names pronounced them badly. Prisoners were told to step forward, identify property, and submit to inventory. Wedding bands, fountain pens, photographs, notebooks, and keepsakes passed into numbered envelopes under the supervision of a clerk who seemed offended by objects that hinted at private lives. One of the older women tried to explain in broken English that the small tin cross in her hand had belonged to her son. The clerk reached for it without looking up. "Property envelope," he said. "It is not a weapon," she replied. "It is still property." Before the argument could sour, Reed stepped closer. "Write the item carefully," he told the clerk. "Don't just put religious article. Put tin cross on string, homemade." The clerk frowned. "Regulations don't require. They do if you plan to return it to the right person later." Brogan gave Reed a look that mixed annoyance with amusement. "You planning to run a museum?" "No," Reed said. "I'm planning not to lose people inside the system any more than the war already has." Anna Weiss heard that. It showed only in the brief movement of her eyes. Her own property consisted of a comb with missing teeth, a handkerchief embroidered with the initials AW, a silver ring, one photograph of an older woman in a coat too heavy for the season, and a notebook with more blank pages and writing. When the clerk reached for the notebook, she spoke for the first time. "That one must not be destroyed." He laughed once. "Nothing's being destroyed." She held his gaze. "In war, that answer has often meant the opposite." Brogan muttered, "Smart mouth." Reed extended his hand. "Give it here." Anna hesitated, then passed a notebook to him instead of to the clerk. Reed opened it. Most of the pages were empty. On one page was a list of dates and names. On another, a line in German. He did not read it aloud. "It will be inventoried," he said, "not destroyed." "Can you guarantee that?" "In this place," Reed replied, "I can guarantee that I'll write it down clearly." She looked at him a second longer. "That is more honest than most guarantees." There was no kindness in his tone yet, only procedural steadiness. But in wartime, the first form of kindness was often refusal to be careless. The women were taken to barracks are 3 inside the restricted compound. The barrack had been built for dry efficiency, not dignity. Its plank walls held heat badly at night and trapped it cruelly in the afternoon. 2 of the cots sagged. One blanket stack was short by a count of 3. The water drum near the door was half empty. Whoever had prepared the room had done enough to satisfy inspection, which was not always enough to satisfy decency. Brogan glanced around. "Looks fine to me." Reed counted cots, then blankets. He checked the drum, knocked the tap, listened to the hollow answer. "It isn't." "They're here, aren't they?" Roof over their heads. No shells falling. Reed turned. "Would you like your quarters judged that way?" Brogan barked a laugh. "They're prisoners. They're still human." Brogan lowered his voice. "You forget what side they're on." Reed's face hardened in a way Brogan had not seen before. "No," he said quietly. "My brother is in a cemetery in France. I don't forget anything. Get the quartermaster." Brogan stared at him a moment, then gave a half shrug and walked off with the exaggerated looseness of a man who disliked being corrected by someone calmer than himself. The women set down their bundles in silence. The limping prisoner, Gertrude Falk, lowered herself to a cot and exhaled through her nose, as if even sitting had become a negotiation. Another, a younger woman named Inga Voss, surveyed the room with flat contempt. Anna remained standing. She glanced from the missing blankets to Reed. "Do all American camps begin by counting shortages?" she asked. "Only the ones run by tired men," he answered. "And the others?" "The others count properly the first time." For a moment something like almost smile flickered at the corner of her mouth, but it vanished before it could become trust. By noon the missing blankets had arrived, along with fresh water and 1 replacement cot. Reed signed the delivery himself and made the quartermaster initial the correction. It was not heroism. It would never appear in a medal citation. No battle line changed because 5 women did not sleep cold that night. Yet war was full of large crimes that depended on small permissions. Reed had come to believe the opposite was also true, that whatever remained of civilization in wartime survived by small refusals. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the western ridge and the floodlights came alive around the compound, the camp chaplain walked the main lane, reading names from a mail list that contained more blanks than letters. Somewhere in another section, German prisoners sang softly after chow, a hymn perhaps, or a song from the Rhineland, their voices thinned through the wire. In R3, no one sang. The women unpacked what little remained to them. The silver ring went into Anna's pocket because she would not wear it where inventories could count it too easily. The photograph she kept beside her pillow. The notebook she received back at lights out when Reed made final rounds. He stopped at the door. Wise. She crossed the room and stood with the distance of someone approaching a checkpoint. Reed handed her the envelope. Property reissued for supervised personal use. It stays in the barack unless ordered otherwise. She took it carefully. Why this exception? It isn't an exception. It's recorded. That is not what I asked. The guard in the tower coughed. Wind moved sand along the base of the fence, like low water around pilings. Reed answered without lowering his voice, because he had no interest in secrecy, because a person with nothing left but a few words ought to be allowed to keep them, provided the words don't start fire. Anna looked at the notebook, then back at him, and if they described one, then write it honestly. When he walked away, he did not turn back, but from a lane he could feel the weight of the camp settling into night, towers humming with electricity, boots on gravel, the distant clatter from the kitchen, the old American confidence that any difficult moral arrangement could be made acceptable if enough boards were painted and enough forms were filed. War liked that confidence. It fed on it. In the weeks that followed, Red Mesa revealed itself in layers. Morning siren. Roll call. Mess. Work detail or confinement. Inventory. Inspection. Repeat. The camp existed by routine, because routine kept men from thinking too long about the contradiction of defending freedom by building fences. The guards joked, smoked, cursed the weather, rode home, and tried not to imagine the places where their own names might one day appear on lists. The prisoners adapted at different speeds. Some shrank into obedience. Some cultivated defiance because it was the last possession no one had successfully inventoried. Most moved somewhere between those extremes, measuring survival in grams of bread and inches of silence. Anna Weiss proved difficult to classify. She was not meek, but she was not theatrical. She obeyed orders with the precision of someone who believed chaos was more dangerous than humiliation. She spoke English fluently when she chose to, though at first she preferred German unless necessary. She did not seek conversation with the other women, yet they deferred to her when instructions needed translating. She kept her bunk neat enough to irritate the inspectors. She spent spare minutes writing in a notebook Reed had recorded so carefully, then closing at the instant footsteps approached. Brogan distrusted her immediately. That one's listening all the time, he said one afternoon while the women carried laundry sacks across the restricted yard. You ever notice? Like she's counting things. Most prisoners count things, Reed said. Days, guards, doors, chances. Brogan smirked. You make it sound admirable. No, I make it sound human. Brogan shoved his cap back and watched Anna cross the yard. You know what they did in Europe? Reed's jaw tightened. Some of them? Yes. All of them? That's a different question. You always have a schoolteacher answer for everything, and you always want a simple one. The matter might have ended there if simplicity had not become preferred language of wartime rage. By then, American newspapers carried bigger headlines with every week's advance. Aachen, the Hurricane, Metz, Leyte, bomb tonnage, casualty tables. The names changed, but the pattern remained the same. The farther away the battlefield, the easier it became for people at home to sort the world cleanly into monsters and mourners. Camps like Red Mesa lived inside that simplification. They needed it, even as daily contact kept undermining it. One Tuesday, the women of R3 were taken to the storeroom to receive winter issue, heavier socks, patch coats, wool caps. The quartermaster sergeant tossed garments onto the table as if feeding livestock. Inga Voss snatched hers with obvious contempt. Gertrude thanked no one, but her relief showed in the way she pressed the coat to her chest. When Anna's turn came, the sergeant threw down a coat with one sleeve badly torn. "That's not serviceable," she said. "It'll keep the wind off. It will unravel in 2 days. Then you'll have had 2 days. Brogan chuckled. Reed, who had been checking numbers at the end of the table, looked up. "Issue another." The quartermaster rolled his eyes. "For her? For the recorded prisoner assigned that size?" "Yes." The sergeant flipped through the pile and came up empty. "No more." Reed stepped forward, took the torn coat, examined the sleeve, and held it out. "Then write shortage and replacement pending. Don't call it issued." The sergeant's expression soured. "You think Washington cares about one coat?" "No," Reed said, "but I care about lying on paper." Anna stood still through all of this. When a replacement finally came from another crate, she took it and met Reed's eyes briefly. Later, as the women waited to be escorted back, she spoke in a tone low enough that only he heard. "You correct fabric with more passion than some men correct murder." He answered just as quietly. "In war, people practice with small injustices first." That afternoon the wind rose and turned the sky a pale brown. Dust climbed the fence and settled into bows, hair, and boots. By evening a storm came hard across the flats. It rattled the barracks and sent loose boards knocking. In the restricted compound, one of the roof panels above, are 3 split at the seam. Sand poured into the room in fine sheets. Gertrude and Inga dragged a blanket over the leak. Clara Newman, the frail woman whose cough had worsened steadily since arrival, doubled over and could not stop shivering. The guard assigned to row that night was new and uncertain. He looked at Clara through the open door and said, "Morning sick call." "She is blue with cold." Anna replied, "Morning." "She may not reach morning." The guard shifted from foot to foot. Regulations often frighten inexperienced men more than suffering did. Anna saw the hesitation, and something in her face changed from control restraint to anger. "Do you understand what lungs are?" she demanded. "Do you understand fever? Or only fences?" The guard flushed. "Watch yourself." Reed arrived halfway down the lane, coat collar up, lantern in hand. He read the scene in seconds. "What happened?" The guard straightened. "Prisoner requesting off-hours medical." Anna spoke over him. "Not requesting. Requiring." Reed stepped into the barack. Clara's skin was slick, her breath shallow and fast. He touched the back of her hand, then turned. "Get Lieutenant Adler." The young guard hesitated. "Sir, protocol." "I know protocol. This qualifies. It's after curfew." Reed's voice went flat. "Then Lieutenant Adler will have the rare privilege of practicing medicine after curfew. Move." The young guard vanished into the storm. Reed looked around the room. Sand over blankets. One bucket already half full where the roof leaked. Gertrude muttering prayers. Inga pacing anger into the floorboards. Anna stood beside Clara's cot holding a damp cloth that had warmed almost instantly in her hand. "You knew she was worsening," Reed said. "We reported it twice." "To whom?" Anna named a medical orderly. Reed nodded once, the way men do when filing away evidence against a future conversation. Lieutenant Miriam Adler arrived 10 minutes later with a medic and a canvas bag. She was in her early 30s, her hair pinned back, so tightly it seemed part of the uniform. She had the composed face of a doctor who had learned that outrage exhausted itself faster than responsibility. Rumor said her parents had fled Berlin in 1938, and that cousins who stayed behind no longer wrote. None of that changed the way she worked. If anything, it sharpened it. She examined Clara quickly, listened to the lungs, and said, "Pneumonia. Why wasn't she brought in sooner?" Anna answered before any guard could. Because in camps, delays were uniforms too. Adler did not react. Medic, stretcher. She goes to infirmary now. Brogan, who had arrived late and wet and irritated, frowned at the diagnosis. All this for one prisoner with a cough. Adler looked up. "Corporal, if you ever wish to insult medicine in my presence again, at least do it with better vocabulary." Brogan muttered something under his breath and received from Reed a stare sharp enough to finish the argument without words. When Clara had been taken out, and the medic had wrapped the split roof panel in canvas for the night. The storm still hammered the camp. Reed remained at the door longer than necessary. Anna had sand in her hair and a streak of dust across one cheek. She had not noticed. She may live. Anna asked. Adler, closing her bag, answered plainly, if the fever breaks and if the lungs hold, that is the truth. The truth, Anna said softly, has become very expensive. Adler met her gaze. More expensive when delayed. After the doctor left, Reed stayed to help drag one cot away from a leak. He did it without ceremony, as though moving furniture home and not inside a fenced wartime compound. Gertrude watched him with suspicious gratitude. Inga, who disliked any kindness that complicated hatred, folded her arms. Is this common in America? She asked. Guards doing labor for prisoners? It's common, Reed said, straightening, for useful work to get done by whoever is standing closest to it. Inga sneered. Your country still keeps us behind wire. Yes, Reed replied, and yours built places where people did not come out at all. I suggest we both avoid self-congratulation. Silence filled the barack after that. Even Anna said nothing. But from that night forward, whatever she thought of America remained more complicated than contempt. Clara survived. The fever broke on the third day. Lieutenant Adler later told Reed, 2 more nights and she would have drowned in her own chest. Reed wrote a report naming the orderly who had ignored the first complaint. The orderly was reassigned. No speeches were made. Institutions rarely apologize when corrected. They simply altered paperwork and went on. Winter moved in lightly by northern standards, but hard enough for the desert. Mornings came cold and sharp. Breath whitened at roll call. Mess hall coffee tasted of scorched metal and effort. The women of our 3 were given sewing work and occasional laundry sorting under supervision. They handled blankets, shirts, torn cuffs, and uniforms from men they never saw. War always created strange intimacies. A prisoner could mend the sleeve of the man guarding her and never know his name. One afternoon, Reed found Anna in the small yard during recreation hour, reading a worn copy of the Red Badge of Courage from the camp's neglected shelf of English books. The camp library, if it could be called that, occupied 3 cabinets near the administration hut and had been assembled from church donations, discards, and confiscated reading material deemed harmless. Many guards ignored it. Reed had reorganized it during an especially empty week. Discovering that camps like schools revealed their deepest values and how badly they treated books. You read fast, he said from outside the fence gate. Anna looked up. A camp gives time to pages, if not to people. Do you like it? She held up the novel. It is strange. Because it is American? Because it is honest about fear. Reed considered that. Most war stories aren't. No, Anna said. Most war stories are advertisements sent backward in time. The wind turned a page for her. She pressed it down. Why this book? She asked. Because it was in the cabinet. Not that. Why did your country keep books like this while preparing boys to fight? Same reason churches pray for peace and bless cannons, he said. A nation likes to believe it can preserve its conscience and use it too. For the first time she laughed once, dryly. That sounds less like America than like every country. Probably. She closed the book on a finger to keep the place. In Germany, before the war, a teacher once told my class that literature strengthens discipline because it teaches sacrifice. Later the government said literature strengthens purity because it teaches the soul of the nation. Then certain books disappeared. Then certain teachers did. Reed leaned one shoulder against the post. And what did you think? That words were becoming uniforms. He nodded. That's usually how the trouble starts. She studied him a moment. You speak like a man older than his face. I had students. And a war. Yes. She looked back at the book. Is it true what they say? That Americans think war can make men good. Some do, he said. Most are wrong. What do you think it makes? He did not answer immediately. Somewhere across the main compound a whistle blew, followed by voices and the metallic slam of a gate. War makes choices faster, he said at last. It strips away the excuses people prefer in peacetime. Some men become brave. Some become cruel. Most become whatever habits they practiced before the shooting started. Anna let that sit between them. Then she said, "And what habits did you practice before?" "Alphabetizing books, correcting grammar, believing rules were there to protect the weak from the strong. And now I still believe that," he said. "I've just learned rules can also be sharpened into weapons if the wrong people write them." She reopened the novel. That is a better answer than propaganda. It would have been easy in a lesser story to let that exchange drift toward sentiment. War produced enough loneliness to make sentiment tempting. But what grew between Reed and Anna was not romance. It was recognition, which in wartime was far rarer and far more dangerous. He recognized in her the discipline of someone educated to serve a system and wounded by what it had demanded. She recognized in him a kind of decency that did not depend on liking her. This mattered. Mercy rooted in affection can disappear with mood. Mercy rooted in principle survives insult, fatigue, and public suspicion. By December, Red Mesa received new instructions regarding prisoner correspondence. Under Red Cross channels and strict word limits, certain detainees could send brief family messages if addresses were verifiable. The process was maddeningly bureaucratic. 25 words. No military information. No complaints beyond health status. No references that might be coded. Whole lives were squeezed into sentences with the efficiency of wartime rationing. When the notice was posted, prisoners reacted with a kind of quiet panic. Some had no addresses left to trust. Some did not know which cities still stood. Some feared writing names that might expose relatives to authorities on either side. In R. 3, Gertrude asked for her son in Cologne, though she had not heard from him since 1943. Inga sneered that the Red Cross served victors first and pity second. Anna said nothing for most of the day. At evening administrative hour, Reed found her standing outside the office hut door with the application form unfilled in her hand. "You need translation?" he asked. "No," she said. "I need arithmetic." He took the form. 25 words. That is the arithmetic. He gestured toward the bench under the awning. "Sit." Rain was rare in Red Mesa, but a thin winter drizzle had begun, tapping on the tin roof and turning dust to dark paste under boots. Anna sat with reluctance, as if requesting help from a guard might alter the balance she had worked hard to preserve. "The address?" Reed asked. "Hanover. My mother's last known street. The building may not exist now. Write it anyway." "I have not heard from her in 11 months. "Then all the more reason." She held the pencil, but did not move. 25 words is an insult. "Yes, and yet it is what they offer." "Yes." She stared at the blank line, then said very quietly, "How does one compress fear?" "One noun at a time," Reed replied. That might have sounded cruel from another man. From him, it was merely practical. She began to write, stopped, crossed out the first attempt, started again. "Alive in American camp. Healthy enough. Please answer if living. I think of home every day." "Anna," she counted with her finger. 19. "It sounds false," she said. "It sounds survivable." "I do not think of home every day," she admitted. "Some days I think only of tomorrow. Some days I am angry at home. Some days I do not know what home means anymore." "None of that fits in 25 words," Reed said. "And healthy enough is absurd. Are you alive?" "Yes." "Can you stand?" "Yes." Then in wartime bureaucracy, healthy enough is practically poetry. Against her will, she almost smiled again. Then the expression faded. "May I add my brother's name?" "If you have room." She rewrote the message. "Alive in American camp. Safe. Please answer if mother lives. Have you word of Carl? I remember home. Anna Weiss." 22 words. "I remember home," she murmured. "That is truer." Reed read it twice. Good. She did not hand over form immediately. What happens if the answer comes and says she is dead? Then at least the uncertainty ends. "That is a soldier's answer. It's a teacher's answer, too," he said. "Uncertainty teaches the worst lessons." She finally passed him the paper. Their fingers did not touch. He stamped the form, entered the date, and placed it with the others in the outgoing file. Anna remained seated a moment longer, watching the rain. "Why do you help?" she asked without looking at him. "Do not say regulation. You help before the regulation matters." Reed followed her gaze toward the yard, where droplets were gathering along the lowest strand of wire like glass beads. "Because camps are dangerous places for guards as well as prisoners," he said. She turned to him, puzzled. "You are armed." "That's not what I mean. Places like this teach men to enjoy indifference. Once a man learns that, he carries it home, to his wife, to his children, to strangers, to himself. And helping me prevents that?" "Maybe not," he said, "but it prevents one more day of practicing the opposite." She studied him carefully, as if deciding whether this answer belonged to conviction or vanity. Apparently satisfied, she rose. "In Germany," she said, "many people told themselves that small cruelties were temporary, necessary, administrative. They said the real guilt lived elsewhere, higher up, farther away." Reed nodded once. "That's how it spreads." The reply from Hanover did not come before Christmas. Most did not. War moved paper slower than grief. The holiday passed through Red Mesa awkwardly. The chaplain arranged the service. The cook tried to stretch canned fruit into something resembling celebration. Some German prisoners sang carols with such aching familiarity that even Brogan fell quiet for a verse. In R3, Gertrude fashioned a tiny star from thread wrapped around matchsticks. Inga refused to participate in what she called American theater. Anna stood near the window during the evening service and listened without singing. Afterward, Reed made rounds with a box of donated books. He stopped at the women's barack. "Library exchange," he announced. Gertrude chose a German Bible, missing its final pages. Clara, still weak but recovering, picked a book of fairy tales. Inga rejected everything on principle. Anna examined the stack and lifted a thick volume with a damaged spine. "Dickens?" she asked. "That surprises you? In a camp?" "Slightly." "Americans donate Dickens for every crisis," Reed said. "Floods, orphanages, prisons. We trust the Englishman to make misery feel literate." She glanced at the cover. "A Tale of Two Cities. That seems less donation than commentary. Take it anyway." As he turned to leave, Gertrude called after him, "Sergeant." He faced her. She touched the matchstick star on the sill. "This remains, as long as it is not used to saw through the wall." Gertrude sniffed. "At my age, Sergeant, if I begin escaping by wall sawing, history has become ridiculous." Even Reed smiled at that. "Then let history rest a night. There are years in every war when the facts arrive too slowly for conscience to keep up. And then there are moments when the facts break through all defenses at once. For Germany in early 1945, and for the world that had been fighting Germany. Such moments came with the liberation of camps in Europe. First rumors, then documents, then photographs, then eyewitness accounts so terrible they appeared, for a brief and shameful time, exaggerated even to decent people. Piles of shoes, barracks of bones, names erased and numbers preserved, machinery devoted not to detention, but to annihilation. When the first newspapers carrying those images reached Red Mesa, the atmosphere of the camp changed in a day. Until then, many guards had sustained their duties through ordinary wartime hatred. The enemy as a soldier, a bomber, an invader, a uniform on the other side of a rifle sight. Now the enemy was increasingly imagined as something larger and more contaminated, something collective enough to stain every language spoken behind the wire. Men who had tolerated prisoners as military inconvenience began looking at them as accomplices to a civilizational crime. Some were not. Most had lived somewhere in the polluted territory between participation, fear, ignorance, ambition, obedience, and selective blindness. Wartime rage had little patience for such distinctions. Brogan slapped a newspaper against the mess table one morning, the photographs visible even upside down. "They did this," he said loudly enough for nearby prisoners to hear. No one answered. "Look at it," he insisted, shoving the paper toward a group of German prisoners assigned to kitchen cleanup. "Look." The men looked because refusing would have been interpreted as guilt. One crossed himself. Another stared until his face emptied. A third said in barely audible English, I did not know. Brogan barked. You expect me to believe that? Reed, carrying inventory slips, stopped behind him. Corporal. Brogan rounded on him. Don't start. Take your anger to someone who can return it properly. These bastards all were the same eagle. Reed's voice stayed level. And you wear ours. If that means anything, act like it. Brogan looked ready to throw the newspaper. Instead, he crumpled one corner in his fist and stalked outside. The command office issued contradictory instructions over the next week. Show the reports to prisoners. Do not incite violence. Maintain discipline. Expect unrest. Monitor for propaganda reaction. One memo suggested withholding photographs from certain compounds. Another argued that concealment would strengthen denial. The result, as often happens in bureaucracies under moral stress, was confusion enforced at volume. Anna first saw the photographs in Lieutenant Adler's infirmary office. She had come to deliver mended linen. The doctor had left a newspaper folded on her desk. The top photograph showed survivors behind wire, their faces so altered by starvation that identity seemed barely attached to flesh. Anna stopped walking. The linen slid from her hands to the floor. Adler came in a moment later and saw what she was looking at. You can read English, the doctor said. Yes. Then read the article too, not just a photograph. Anna did, eyes moving too fast at first, then slowing as details resisted evasion. Camp liberated. Thousands dead. Crematoria. Testimony from soldiers. Civilian populations brought through to witness. She gripped the paper harder. This is enemy reporting, she said, but without force. Adler did not soften. Yes, and also true. Anna looked up. How can you know? Adler held her gaze. Because lies and truth leave different fingerprints. Something in Anna's face gave way, not into tears but into a smaller, more frightening expression. A mind attempting to reassemble itself while the pieces were still falling. In Germany, she said, we heard rumors, always rumors, Eastern exaggerations, enemy inventions, criminals resettled, labor camps, disease, sabotage, too many stories, too many official voices. Adler's tone turned quieter, though not kinder. What did you choose to believe? Anna answered after a long pause. What allowed life to continue? That, Adler said, has been the favorite answer of the century. Reed encountered Anna later that same day in the yard, standing motionless beneath the pale sun. Other prisoners moved around her, as if around a broken instrument. He approached only close enough to be heard. Lieutenant Adler told me you saw the reports. Anna nodded. She also told me you nearly fainted. I did not faint. Good. It would create paperwork. For the first time in weeks, humor failed to land. She turned to him with a face stripped of its usual control. If even half of this is true, she said, holding the folded paper, then everything was built over a grave. Reed said nothing. She went on, voice tightening, and everyone said the same thing. Necessary, temporary, security, order, hygiene, purity, transport, labor. Words like clean uniforms overwrought. We use words until they no longer belong to reality. Yes, Reed said, and now you stand there being decent to me. Do you understand how unbearable that is? The question startled him more than anger would have. Explain it, he said. Her hand trembled once against the newspaper. Because if you were cruel, the world would make sense. Enemy guard, enemy prisoner, fence, hatred, easy. But if you are decent, then I must think about where decency stopped in my country, and when, and in whom, and why it did not stop me sooner. Reed took a breath. Thinking about that is probably the beginning. Of what? Of not lying to yourself anymore. She laughed once, broken and bitter. Do Americans always believe beginnings are redemptive? No, he said. Sometimes they're just painful. That night tension flared in the camp. 2 drunken enlisted men from another section shouted abuse toward German prisoners during transfer detail. A rock struck the wall of barracks. R2. Someone proposed canceling recreation for all German detainees. Someone else suggested removing books and writing materials on the theory that news of atrocities might trigger coded communication or propaganda denial. Fear and vindictiveness frequently dress alike and pass for security in moments like these. At the evening staff meeting, Brogan argued for harsher treatment. You've seen the photographs. They don't deserve reading hour. Reed leaned back in the folding chair, exhausted beyond anger. What exactly do you think harsher treatment proves? That we're not fools. It proves we can imitate what we claim to hate, only more sloppily. Captain Wallace Kent, the camp commander, a career officer who valued order because it simplified both duty and sleep, tapped his pencil on the table. Enough. There will be no group punishment without a direct disciplinary cause. Brogan scoffed. With respect, sir, that's soft. Kent looked at him. No, Corporal. It's control. Learn the distinction. The book stayed. The paper stayed. The camp held together, though more tightly than before. In the days after, Anna spoke less. When she did, her words sounded chosen from farther away. She asked for more newspapers and read them carefully. She stopped defending Germany in any form, which made Inga Voss furious. You swallow everything the enemy prints, Inga hissed one evening in the barack. You shame us. Anna, seated on her cot with a newspaper folded in her lap, did not look up. No, what shames us has already happened. You know nothing. I know enough to fear what I chose not to know earlier. Inga's face reddened. Traitor, Gertrude, sewing a cuff nearby, spoke without raising her head. At our age, dear girl, truth is not treason. It is only late. The barack fell quiet. Outside, Reed passed by on patrol and heard nothing but the wind. By March, as Allied armies moved deeper into Germany and the front lines closed around the Reich, Red Mesa became a place of waiting sharpened by rumor. Prisoners waited for letters, for news, for capitulation, for revenge, for transport, for anything that would convert suspended life into the next misery. Guards waited for home leave, discharge, telegrams, and the end of service. The camp itself waited for instructions from a government not yet ready to think beyond victory. In waiting places, small incidents grow teeth. The incident that nearly destroyed Anna came from a fire no larger than a kitchen table. It started in supply shed for just before dawn, when the night temperature was lowest and the guards most dull by routine. A stack of blanket bales caught, then a shelf of cleaning fluid, and for 6 violent minutes the shed threw sparks high enough to wake the nearest barracks. Men ran with buckets. An alarm bell clanged. By the time the flames were beaten down, one wall was blackened and a month's worth of winter inventory smelled like smoke and wet wool. At first it looked accidental. Then a crate of ration tins was found pried open, and one padlock lay in the dirt with obvious tool marks. Theft became sabotage in the imagination of every angry man within 50 yards, because the shed had been accessed by a work detail the previous afternoon. Suspicion fell quickly and stupidly on the prisoners assigned nearby. Anna had been there translating inventory numbers for Gertrude and Clara. That made her dangerous in the minds of those who believed language itself was a form of conspiracy. Brogan entered the restricted yard with 2 MPs, and a satisfaction he did not bother to hide. Anna Weiss, he called, on your feet. She rose slowly from the bench where she had been sorting laundry tags. For what charge? You can hear at the office. In English or in German? In whichever language liars prefer. The other women started speaking at once. Gertrude protesting, Clara frightened, Inga watching with unreadable intensity. Reed, coming down the lane at a jog, intercepted the group before they reached the gate. What is this? Brogan answered first, questioning. She had access to the shed. So did 3 orderlies, 2 guards, and a mule driver. Reed said. Who signed off? Captain's office. Then I'll walk with you. Brogan scowled. Not necessary. Exactly why I'm coming. The interrogation room in Red Mesa was not a dungeon. It was worse in the bureaucratic way camps often prefer. A plain office, 1 chair for the subject, 2 for the questioners, a metal fan, a legal pad, a portrait of the president, and enough artificial normality to imply that whatever happened there was merely procedure. Brogan liked the room because it converted suspicion into atmosphere before a word was spoken. Anna sat straight backed at the table. Reed remained against the wall. Lieutenant Harlan Pike from Intelligence Section handled initial questioning, not because he was especially skilled, but because he enjoyed the illusion that suspicion made him perceptive. You were in supply shed 4 yesterday afternoon. Pike said, yes. You translated inventory for the older women. Yes. You had occasion to move behind the ration crates. I had occasion to read numbers on a wall shelf. Did you remove anything? No. Did you observe any irregularities? Yes. Pike looked up. What irregularities? One lock already loose, Anna said, and the smell of liquor on Corporal Jenks. Brogan shifted. Pike scribbled. Why did you not report this? Anna held his gaze. Because in camps there is often no reward for reporting the wrong man. Reed almost smiled despite the circumstances. Pike continued. Did you leave any cloth, paper, or combustible material in the shed? No. Did you discuss the shed with any other prisoner after returning to barracks? No. Did you say in English that Americans were careless with supplies? Anna paused. Yes. Brogan pounced. There. She turned to him, because Corporal Jenks stacked lamp oil beside dry wool and smoked near the door. Pike looked from one to the other. Can anyone corroborate? Sergeant Reed can corroborate that I have said Americans are careless with supplies on more than one occasion, Anna said. He appears to agree sometimes. Reed pushed off the wall. She's not wrong. Pike frowned. Sergeant, unless asked. You asked for corroboration. The questioning might have continued in circles if not for an inconvenient fact. Corporal Jenks, hauled in from morning barracks with smoke still in his coat and a hangover large enough to perfume the hall, admitted under pressure that he had indeed opened a ration crate intending to steal tins for a poker debt and had left a cigarette near the cleaning shelf in the confusion. There had been no sabotage, only petty theft and negligence, the most common causes of disaster in any century. Brogan looked cheated by the truth. After Jenks was removed, Pike closed the file with an irritated snap. Very well. Release. Anna stood, but did not move toward the door. Will the accusation remain in my record? Pike shrugged. Preliminary suspicion only. Reed spoke before he could reconsider. Strike entirely. Pike stared. That's not standard. It is when suspicion was unsupported and arose from access common to half the detail. Pike's lips thinned. You grow protective. I grow tired of sloppiness, Reed said. The lieutenant hesitated, then drew one line through the entry. It was a narrow, ordinary line of ink. In bureaucratic life, such lines can decide years. Outside, the air smelled of wet ash and cold rope. Anna walked beside Reed toward the yard gate, neither speaking at first. If Jenks had not confessed, she asked, then I'd have kept pushing. Against your own officers? Yes. She looked ahead. Why? Because false accusations become habits in camps too. They reached the gate. The tower guard looked down without interest. Anna turned to face him. There are many kinds of courage, she said. Most countries only teach one. Reed answered. Most countries only reward one. Spring came hot and early. The desert began to shimmer by mid-morning. Lizards returned to the fence posts. Tempers shortened with the waterline. News from Europe grew more rapid and less coherent. Bridges taken. Cities entered. Villages found ruined. Columns surrendering. Hitler still alive. Hitler perhaps wounded. Hitler hidden. Hitler finished. For prisoners, each rumor rearranged the shape of the future, without making it any more bearable. Then, in late April, the reply from Hanover finally came. It was not a letter in the ordinary sense. It was a Red Cross return form, typed and retyped, carrying only a few sanctioned words and the bureaucratic scars of long travel. Reed received the stack in the office and sorted names under a slow ceiling fan. When he found Weiss, and he did not open it further than regulations allowed. He looked once at the date stamp, at the forwarding marks, at the thinness of page. Then he carried it himself to R3. The women were in afternoon work period. Anna sat at the end of the table, mending a shirt collar. Reed called her name. She rose immediately, eyes already fixed on the paper in his hand. For you, he said. She took it, but did not unfold it. No, that was not entirely true. He suspected from the form's handling that the message had been redirected through more than one office. In wartime, paper acquired a smell of bad news before the words were read. Anna opened it carefully. Her eyes moved once left to right, stopped, and then went back to the beginning as though the language had changed midway. Gertrude stood. "What is it?" Anna answered in German first, too low for the others, then in English, as if translating her own blow made it more final. "Mother dead after October raid. No word of Carl since January in the East." The room remained still. Even Inga said nothing. Reed heard the smallest sound then. Not a cry, not a gasp, but the involuntary breath a person makes when a future collapses inward and leaves nowhere else to store itself. Anna folded the paper once, twice, with absurd neatness. Then she sat back down and continued holding the needle she no longer saw. Gertrude moved to her side. "Child." "I am 27, Anna said, staring at the collar. "That word is expired." No one corrected her. Reed stepped outside and signaled for Lieutenant Adler. The doctor arrived within minutes, read Anna's face, and did not ask stupid questions. She dismissed work for Barack, authorized rest, and left a packet of aspirin no one pretended could help much. As she turned to go, Anna spoke without looking up. "Lieutenant." Adler paused. "If your relatives in Berlin or elsewhere," Anna stopped, swallowed. "If they are also gone, I do not ask forgiveness for being German. I do not know what that word means anymore. But I ask you to understand that many of us are now inheriting ashes from a government that demanded worship." Adler stood in silence for a long moment. At last she said, "Understanding is not the same as absolution." "I know. And grief is not innocence." "I know that too." Adler nodded once. "Then begin there." After she left, Reed remained near the Barack door on nominal guard duty, though no one had ordered it. Toward evening, Anna came outside alone carrying the Red Cross form. The desert sky had turned the color of old brass. She stood by the fence with the shadow of the wire across her skirt in hard diagonal bars. "She loved roses," Anna said abruptly, as though picking up a conversation from years earlier. "That is the first thing I remember. Not politics, not flags. Roses and rain barrels behind our building." Reed did not interrupt. She hated Hitler's voice. She said it sounded like a man arguing with a mirror, but she still hung the flag on holidays because everyone did, because not hanging it was noticed, because neighbors talked, because survival makes cowards of respectable people long before it asks for criminals. Reed looked out beyond the fence to the desert, where nothing moved but heat. "She told me not to marry the war," Anna continued. "So I did not. I married duty instead. It wore a cleaner face." He answered carefully. "A lot of people did." "That is a terrible comfort." "Yes." She handed him the Red Cross form. "Read it." He hesitated. Then he took it. The message was sparse and mercilessly efficient. Mother deceased after October bombing. House destroyed. Carl missing. Presumed Eastern Front. Neighbor Frau Brenner sends this. "Pray for us." He returned the paper. "I'm sorry." She gave a thin, bitter smile. "You say it like an American. Simple. Clean. How do Germans say it?" "Too long," she replied. "With reasons. Context. History. Weather. Architecture. Regret. We build cathedrals around simple pain because we are afraid to kneel in front of it directly. And today, direct is enough." A gust of wind caught the paper in her hand. She held it firm. "Sergeant Reed," she said, not looking at him. "If Carl is dead in the East, then somewhere there may be a Russian mother who considers this justice. Somewhere there may be a Polish mother who considers it insufficient. Somewhere there may be a Jewish mother who would call it balance on a scale not yet settled." He said nothing because there was nothing clean enough to say. "I understand that," Anna went on. "I understand history does not owe me tenderness. But when one person receives a form like this in a camp and another person stands beside her instead of walking away, the world becomes slightly harder to explain by hate alone." Reed kept his eyes on the fence. "Good. Hate explains too much too cheaply." By early May, Germany was collapsing openly. Radio bulletins came faster than official notices. Hitler dead. Berlin fallen. Armistice imminent. Men in the main compound pressed against wire for rumors they could not verify. Some prisoners seemed relieved. Some seemed emptied out. A few still clung to fantasy with the desperate elegance of gamblers down to their last currency. On the evening news board outside administration, someone chalked the words German surrender expected. An American private added about time beneath it and was ordered to erase the comment by Captain Kent, who disliked editorializing on official boards, if only because it made them look untidy. Victory in Europe Day reached Red Mesa in a gust of whistles, distant cheers from town, and a radio bulletin crackling through the mess hall speaker. Guards shook hands. The cook produced a bottle from somewhere improbable. In the town beyond the camp, church bells rang. In the prisoner compounds, silence spread with astonishing speed. A defeated nation has no choreography for hearing itself end. Reed walked the restricted yard during the afternoon hour. Anna stood near the barrack steps with the other women. Gertrude crossed herself. Clara wept openly, though whether for relief or fear, even she might not have known. Inga stared at the ground as if waiting for the Reich to correct the broadcast by force of will. "It is over," Gertrude whispered. "No," Anna said. "It is lost. That is different." Reed stopped a few paces away. "There will be instructions soon." "Instructions," Anna repeated softly. "The one immortal species." "You're not wrong." She looked toward the distant mountains. "What happens now?" "For the war," he said. "Occupation. Trials. Displacement. Shortages. Arguments about guilt. Arguments about rebuilding. Arguments about which guilt counts first. And for us? For prisoners? Processing. Reclassification. Maybe labor contracts. Maybe repatriation later." "Later," she said. "Always later." The camp commander had anticipated possible unrest and ordered increased patrols, but none came in the restricted compound. There was too much exhaustion for violence. That evening the floodlights burned as always. The fence stood as always. Victory, for those behind wire, was mostly something happening to other people at a distance. Yet it brought new dangers. Once Germany surrendered, the status of individual detainees mattered more, not less. Files were reviewed for transfer priority, political risk, labor value, intelligence use, and zone of repatriation. Old accusations, careless remarks, and convenient labels suddenly hardened into categories that could shape a person's next 5 years. A clerk's laziness in 1944 could become a major injustice in 1945. Reed understood this before many officers did, because school teachers and prison guards both learned quickly how much damage paper can do. When the review list arrived, he checked them out of habit. That was how he found Anna Weiss scheduled for transfer to a high-security holding center in Louisiana, pending possible ideological commitment and intelligence concern. The notation drew in part from the now-struck suspicion entry after the Shed fire, in part from her original restricted handling classification, and in part from the simple fact that no one had bothered to update her file with nuance because nuance took time and brought no promotion. Reed stared at the page a long moment. Then he marched it straight to Captain Kent. "This is wrong." Kent took the file, adjusted his spectacles, and read. "On what basis?" "On the basis that she's not a security case anymore. She's literate, cooperative, nonviolent, medically stable, and there was no evidence in the sabotage matter." Kent tapped the transfer line. "Initial intelligence note says capable English, radio-adjacent service, political reliability uncertain." Reed answered. "That note was written before 6 months of direct observation. We got later evidence." Kent glanced up. "You've taken an unusual interest." "I take an interest in not shipping people into harsher detention because no one bothered to revise a form." Kent leaned back. "And if headquarters prefers caution, then let caution be based on facts, not inertia." There was a pause. Outside the office, the typewriter pool rattled like dry rain. "What are you asking?" Kent said at last. "A full review note. My statement. Lieutenant Adler's medical and behavioral observation. Chaplain Bell's report if he agrees. Reclassification to ordinary civilian prisoner repatriation queue or labor Release pending zone allocation. Kent weighed the request. He was not an unusually moral man, but he was orderly, and order sometimes allies with justice when laziness threatens it. Draft it, he said. I'll sign if it's solid. Reed was already reaching for a chair. It will be. That evening he wrote for 3 straight hours. He described Anna's conduct, language use, work record, disciplinary record, none, response to war news, cooperation in medical emergency, and absence of organized ideological activity. He chose each word with the precision of a man grading a final exam that might determine more than a grade. Lieutenant Adler added a short statement. Subject displays no security, concern in present medical or behavioral observation. Shows psychological distress consistent with war loss and moral disillusionment, not subversion. Chaplain Bell wrote, in a surprisingly elegant hand, if repentance is too theological a word for the Army file, use honesty. She has begun practicing it. The file went forward. For 10 days, nothing happened. Then headquarters returned the review stamped reclassified. Not free, not safe, not redeemed, but not vanished into a harsher pipeline either. When Reed told Anna, he did so in the yard after work period, with no witnesses close enough to transform a moment into gossip. You're off the Louisiana transfer. She blinked once. Why? File review. That is not an answer. It is in Washington. She studied him and understood anyway. You wrote something. Yes. You were not required to. No. A long silence followed. Then she asked a question that mattered more to her than thanks. What did you write? The truth, as I've seen it. She lowered her gaze. That is a dangerous thing for any government to receive, especially during paperwork season. She almost laughed. Then her expression tightened. You realize what this means to me? Probably not fully. It means I remain a person and not only a category. Reed nodded. That was the idea. Anna looked beyond him toward the administration hut, the towers, the long geometry of fences. In school, she said, we were taught that nations are made strong by their victories. And now I think nations are revealed by what they permit their clerks to do. He absorbed that, then said, that should be engraved somewhere unpleasant. Summer thickened. With Germany defeated and the Pacific War still burning, Red Mesa entered a strange half-life. Some guard were transferred out. Some prisoners were put on agricultural labor agreements beyond the main perimeter. The restricted compound loosened at the edges but did not disappear. Too many files still needed destinations. Too many governments were still deciding what should be done with the millions left between front lines and graveyards. Anna worked in the infirmary storeroom part-time under Adler's supervision, sorting linens and recording supplies in both German and English. The work suited her because it required precision, and because it placed her near someone who had no interest in false consolation. She and Adler were never friends. Their history stood too heavily between them for friendship to pretend innocence. But a harder kind of respect grew there, forged from competence and unwelcome truth. Sometimes, if Reed delivered a requisition while Anna was checking stock, the three of them would exchange remarks shaped less by sentiment than by the weary civility of people who had seen enough propaganda to distrust emotional shortcuts. One afternoon, Adler handed Anna a stack of gauze rolls and said, "You count too fast." Anna looked offended. "I count accurately." "You count offensively. Slow down. Accuracy is not improved by trying to outrun judgment." Reed, leaning in the doorway with a clipboard, said, "That might apply to entire governments." Adler shot him a dry glance. "The Army does not pay me to diagnose governments, only individuals, though the symptoms overlap." Anna set down the gauze. "And what is a diagnosis for a century that learns industry before conscience?" Adler answered without drama. "Progress complicated by barbarism." Reed said, "That's too short for a memorial." "It fits on a plaque," Adler replied. Those were the tones wartime adulthood often took. Not eloquent, not heroic, but sharp enough to keep the spare from turning sentimental. In August, the war in the Pacific ended too, suddenly and terribly, by means no one in Red Mesa could yet morally comprehend. Celebration erupted across the country. The camp joined in officially, but subdued. Too many men in uniform had by then learned that one ending only reveals the damage more clearly. The towers remained for a while. The files remained longer. Demobilization did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived with trains, supply shortages, reassignment notices, and exhausted clerks. By late autumn 1945, the first repatriation and release lists for selected German detainees began to circulate. Some would return to zones in occupied Germany. Some with specialist skills might remain temporarily on labor contracts. Some civilians with family connections or sponsorship could seek alternate arrangements. The process was chaotic enough to terrify anyone whose life depended on not being lost inside it. Anna's name appeared not on the first list nor the second, but on a provisional third mark for return to the British zone by spring 1946. It was, under the circumstances, a decent outcome. Hanover lay in ruins, but the British zone gave at least a chance of relative administrative order and less immediate danger than the East. Reed told her the news in the same steady tone he had used months earlier over blankets and books. You'll likely go by train to the coast, then transport. She absorbed it slowly. Back to a country that no longer exists. To territory that does, he said. That's how history starts over. Badly. Gertrude, when informed of her own placement, muttered, "At my age, I had hoped not to be repatriated like cargo." Clara simply cried with relief. Inga Voss remained defiant to the last, insisting Germany would rise purified from defeat, though even she sounded now like someone quoting a dead radio. The final weeks passed under a peculiar tenderness none of the camp regulations had anticipated. People cleaned what they had once only endured. Cots were repaired. Books returned. Names exchanged more freely. Guards who had spent a year pretending distance with professionalism sometimes admitted where they were from. Prisoners who had treated all American voices as one began distinguishing accent from accent, temperament from temperament. It was dangerous, this late humanization. Once recognized a particular, a person could no longer be hated with ideological efficiency. On a cool morning in March 1946, the transport detail for the British Zone Group was posted. Anna Weiss, Gertrude Falk, Clara Newman, and 8 others were to leave before dawn 2 days later. They would carry one issued bag, one blanket roll, and authorized personal effects. Reed read the roster twice, then folded it and put it in his pocket. He was due for discharge not long after. The war, which had entered his life as history, was preparing to leave it as residue. The night before departure, he made one last round to the restricted compound. The floodlights hummed. Sand whispered against the lowest boards. In R, 3 of the women were awake, their belongings packed with the solemn care of people who owned too little to pack carelessly. Gertrude was rolling socks into shoes. Clara sat by the window, holding the fairy tale book she had no space to take. Inga stared at the wall. Anna stood when Reed appeared in the doorway. "Final inspection," he said, then held out a small bundle. "Also this." She took the bundle and opened the paper. Inside were her original photograph, the silver ring, the handkerchief with initials, and the notebook, now fuller than when she arrived. "These should have been reissued at processing," she said. "Yes." "Why now?" "Because I've seen processing." That drew the briefest smile. Gertrude tactfully turned her attention to her shoes. Clara looked away. Reed remained at the threshold, unwilling to pretend privacy in a camp could ever be complete. Anna turned the photograph over in her fingers. "This is the same envelope. I keep records. You keep everything." "No," he said. "Only what should not be lost." She held up the notebook. "This has become dangerous. Then it's probably worth keeping." She opened to the first page, where months earlier one line had been written in German. Reed had never asked about it. Now she translated of her own choice. It says, "The first lie of war is that only the front is at war." He let the words settle. "That's true," he said. "I wrote it on the ship before I came here. And now I would add another sentence." She looked up. "The second lie is that kindness is weakness when institutions are strong." Reed nodded once. "That's better than most speeches I heard in uniform." For a moment, neither moved. The barrack seemed suspended between all its former uses. Prison, shelter, argument, waiting room to history. Anna slid the ring onto her finger, not as ornament but as continuity. I have nothing proper to give you. You don't owe me anything. That is not the point. She thought a moment, then tore one blank page from the back of the notebook and wrote quickly. She folded it once and stepped forward, stopping just short of the invisible line camps teach everyone to respect. For when you are no longer Sergeant Reed, she said. He took the folded page. What is it? A sentence. Her mouth moved in something almost like humor. You Americans trust brief statements. He tucked it into his breast pocket without opening it. Good night, Weiss. Good night, Reed. At dawn, the transport trucks rolled into the compound under a sky not yet committed to color. Departure in camps always looks less dramatic than memory later insists. There are no orchestras, no speeches, just names called, bags lifted, signatures taken, boots on packed dirt, and the ordinary cruelty of leaving a place that should never become familiar. The women boarded in sequence. Gertrude needed a hand up and accepted it from a young private, who suddenly looked embarrassed by his own gentleness. Clara clutched her issue bag and kept glancing back at the infirmary roof as if memorizing it. Inga climbed without assistance and sat rigidly forward. Anna came last. At the truck step she turned. Reed stood with a roster clipboard, cap in hand, already half returned in posture to civilian life. There is one thing I should say plainly, she called down, loud enough for others to hear, but not loud enough to turn intimate. You were right. About which miracle? He replied. That camps are dangerous for guards, too. He did not answer immediately. And, he asked, and that one resists by refusing practice in indifference. The engine coughed alive. A driver shouted for final count. Anna placed one hand on the truck rail. I do not know what Germany will become, she said. I do not know whether I will ever see roses again behind a building that still stands. But I know this. In a place built from wire, rules, shortages, and fear, one American soldier remembered that administration is also a moral act. History records victories badly. It records such things worse. But they matter. The driver barked. Mount up. She climbed in. The tailgate slammed. The trucks moved out through the inner gate, then the outer. Dust rose behind them, gold in the first light. Reed watched until the convoy blurred into the desert road and became, once more, what war made of nearly everything. Distance, paperwork, and a story no one far away would tell correctly on the first attempt. Only after the trucks disappeared did he unfold the page Anna had given him. It contained one sentence in careful English. The measure of a nation at war is not only how fiercely it fights, but how faithfully it restrains itself when it has power over the helpless. He read it twice, then put it back in his pocket. Samuel Reed was discharged that summer. He returned to Ohio, to a school building that smelled of chalk and old varnish. To students born slightly too late to understand why adults spoke in half-finished sentences for years afterward. He taught history differently than before. He no longer described wars as clean lines on maps or dates of campaigns alone. He taught them as pressures exerted on ordinary conscience. He taught that barbarism does not always arrive roaring. Sometimes it comes filed, stamped, and phrased as necessity. He taught that decency is not proven by feelings but by habits, especially in institutions. And when students asked whether one person's conduct mattered inside systems too large to move, he answered with unusual certainty that it did. Anna Weiss returned to a Germany of rubble, ration cards, occupation zones, widows in queues, boys with old men's eyes, and cities trying to remember their pre-war shapes from broken foundations. Whether she found roses again is not recorded. Whether her brother ever returned is not known. Whether she forgave herself or her country is the kind of question archives rarely answer. But one preserved file years later contained a reclassification memo, a Red Cross form, and a translated notebook excerpt. It was enough to suggest that she lived at least long enough to keep writing. History prefers scale. It likes armies, offensives, conferences, surrender documents signed on polished tables. It trusts numbers because numbers appear disciplined. But the moral truth of war often survives elsewhere, in infirmaries, in storerooms, in barracks after curfew, in the sentence a guard chooses not to speak, in the code he insists be counted honestly, In the file, he corrects because indifference would be easier, in the fact that a prisoner learns the name of the man at the fence and discovers he has not forgotten how to remain human. Camp Red Mesa, like many wartime camps, would later be dismantled, lumber reused, wire sold, concrete cracked by sun and neglect. The desert, patient as ever, began taking the place back grain by grain. Lizards returned first, then weeds through foundation seams, then silence larger than memory. Such places vanish physically with deceptive speed. What stays is the argument they leave behind. What does a nation become when fear gives it the power to classify, confine, and command? What does a soldier become when the enemy is no longer charging with a rifle, but waiting behind a locked door? What remains of law when hatred claims urgency? And what remains of conscience when paperwork offers the comfort of distance? The war answered these questions in many terrible ways. Yet not only terribly. In one camp in the American desert, under watchtowers and floodlights, a German woman who had served a disastrous regime and a grieving American soldier who had buried a brother on foreign soil encountered one another inside the machinery of captivity. Neither purified the other. Neither erased history. Neither escaped the age they had been born into. But for a season, in a place designed to reduce persons to categories, one of them chose not to practice indifference, and the other was forced to confront what kindness reveals when hatred can no longer explain the world. That is not the largest story of the Second World War. It may, however, be one of the stories that explains whether the world that survived it deserved to.